To our webinar by Dr. George Nash on prehistoric rock art in Wales. Before we start, and while we've still got people joining us, I'd just like to give you a little bit of background to this talk. The webinar is organised by Scotland's Rock Art Project, or ScRAP, which is a 5-year project working with communities across the country to record, research and raise awareness of prehistoric rock carvings in Scotland. The project is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who we're very, very grateful to, and it's run by Historic Environment Scotland in partnership with Edinburgh University and Glasgow School of Art. And we're really grateful to Glasgow School of Art for hosting this webinar on their Zoom account tonight. So all the Scotland's Rock Art Project team are here with us tonight. So I'll just introduce you to everyone. We've got me, I'm the principal investigator of the project, and with me tonight are Linda, our data analyst, who is also moderating the webinar this evening. We've got Joanna, who is our research assistant. Guillaume, who is one of the 2 co-investigators on the project from Edinburgh University School of History, Classics and Archaeology, and Stuart, our second co-investigator from Glasgow School of Art, School of Simulation and Visualisation. So the Rock Art Project, Scotland's Rock Art Project, started in 2017 and we're finishing at the end of December this year. So because this is our final year, we're organising a number of events to promote and celebrate Scotland's rock art, and also to promote and celebrate the work of the project and the fantastic work of our community teams. So tonight's talk is part of a series of webinars that are running throughout this year, once a month. So this is the 3rd in the series. And the webinars are being presented by experts from Britain and Europe on themes that are relevant to Scotland's rock art. And you can find out more details about the webinar series and all our other events on our website events page. So before I move on and introduce you to George Nash, tonight's speaker, there's just a few housekeeping things to go through, to be aware of, particularly for the benefit of people who've perhaps not joined us for one of our webinars before. First of all, the talk is being recorded and we'll put it onto our website events page within 2 weeks of the event. You'll be muted and your videos will be turned off throughout this talk, but please use the chat box, so the icon at the bottom of your screen. Please use the chat box if you want to talk to each other, to talk to us, tell us where you're joining us from here tonight, and flag up any technical issues, like if you lose sound or anything like that. We'd appreciate it if you could keep the chat relevant and appropriate, and also be aware of URL links which are posted into the chat box, because it can be open to spam, so don't click on any links that appear in the chat box. Also, if you want to prevent messages kind of popping up in front of the screen from the chat box, you can always keep the chat open on the right-hand side of your screen throughout the talk. If you want to ask the speaker a question, and George is happy to answer questions after his talk, please don't use the chat box. Can you use the Q&A box at the bottom? You'll see a little icon at the bottom of your screen. So use the Q&A box to post a question for the speaker, and you can ask a question at any point during the talk, and we'll go through these when George has finished speaking and put them to him in the rest of the webinar. So just a reminder, use the chat box for chat and the Q&A box for questions. So that's all the housekeeping stuff over and done with. And now I'm really pleased to welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. George Nash. Hello, George. George is Associate Professor at the Geosciences Centre of Coimbra University in Portugal, which he's been associated with since 2009. But George has been a professional and academic archaeologist for 30 years, so he must have started very young. And he's really packed things in that time. So as well as the many other archaeological projects that he's been doing around the world, he's conducted extensive fieldwork on prehistoric rock art and portable art in Brazil, Chile, Malaysia, Spain, Sardinia, Sweden, Norway, and of course Wales, where he's rewritten the narrative of rock art in Wales. He's also excavated several Neolithic burial monuments containing rock art, some of which I'm pretty sure we're going to be hearing more about this evening. George has written and edited numerous books, including several publications on rock art in Britain and Europe, and he's currently working with Dr. Aaron Maisel from Newcastle University on a new edited volume of rock art in Britain and Ireland. So that's something to look out for if you're looking for Christmas presents later this year. George is a co-founder of the British Rock Art Group, or BRAG, and many of you who are joining us tonight may have been to one of the BRAG conferences, the annual conferences. The next one is coming up on the 5th of June, and I think there's going to be details circulated about that shortly, so we'll put those up on our Facebook page as well when we get them. So George is focusing tonight on rock art in Wales, and we're really looking forward to hearing all about his very exciting work and all the new discoveries he's been making. So he's talking tonight on Is Wales a Prehistoric Rock Art Backwater? New discoveries and ideas for why it's not. So George, welcome.
Thank you, Tertia. I hope you can all hear me. I think I'll start with just a brief 30-second scenario, which I think all of us who are doing research sort of fall into. About 35 years ago, maybe a little bit more in fact, I had just been awarded my degree, and I came to that terrible crossroads. What the hell do I do next? And if it wasn't for, I mention his name because he was one of my heroes, Chris Tilley, was at Lampeter at the time where I was studying, and he just said, what are you saying on to do with art, rock art? And guess what? I've been stuck with it ever since. Now, this is quite important, an important sort of turning point for me, because prior to becoming a graduate and a postgraduate, I'd been very interested in Neolithic chambered tombs. And tonight I'm going to be talking about Neolithic chambered tombs between that golden period in the British Isles between 4000 and 2000 BC. But for a long time, I'd been with blinkers looking at the architecture. I hadn't even bothered looking at the landscape. So after that that light bulb moment back in the late 1980s, I was switched on to looking at rock art, landscape, looking at context. And in many respects, this is the reason why I'm here today, is because of that one moment of Chris Tilley saying, why don't you do something to do with art, rock art? And so that's why I'm here. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the issues, some of the issues we have with this part of the British Isles. I'm sort of envious of Tertia and her team because they have many hundreds, maybe thousands of rock art sites in Scotland and in northern Britain as well. But there's very little in terms of tangible rock art that we have seen up until around about 2000, when I started to look deeply into the landscape and finding this wonderful material. So let's see why it is not moving on. There we are, sorry. So this is the sort of traditional view of what a Neolithic, or what Neolithicization is all about. And again, we're looking at that golden sort of 2000 years between 4000 and 2000 BC. And what you've got there is a classic, it's actually a Welsh reconstruction of a site called Predominant, which is down in southwest Wales. It was excavated way back in 1903. And as you can see, it's a very much a sort of working landscape. But just below that working landscape, we have chambered tombs, and we also have just a little bit of rock art as well. So that's the sort of typical view of what Neolithic life was like in Wales between 4000 and 2000 BC. The influences for rock art are quite interesting, because what we've got in terms of the architecture of Neolithic chambered tombs coming into Wales is really a two-pronged attack. And what I want you to remember is this wonderful gentleman, one of my heroes, a guy called Hubert Savary. And Hubert Savary was around in the 1950s, and he was I think one of the first keepers of the National Museum of Wales. But his interests were Neolithic monuments, not just within Wales, but also within Spain and Portugal. And in fact, he wrote a very good book, Thames and Hudson, on the prehistory of Spain and Portugal. But the word he introduced me to is the word hybridization. And what we've got within Wales is this fusion of different types of architecture coming in, different types of influence coming in. And so we've got an influence coming in from Brittany, from the south along what we call the Atlantic facade. That's moving into Ireland, and then from Ireland into Wales. And really the Irish Sea is very much a superhighway, something which Vicky Cummins and Alistair Whittle have been talking a lot about 10 or 15 years ago. But you've got these influences coming in, not just the architecture, but also the art as well. But also at the same time, and this is where Hubert Savary brings in his ideas of hybridization, you've also got influences coming from the east. So you've got all the architectural design work of building, constructing monuments from what we call the LBK in northern Germany, moving into the Paris Basin around about 4000 BC, then moving into southeastern England. You've got then the Long Mounds, the 7 Cotswold monuments, and they are coming in and fusing, or the architectural ideas are fusing together to create these hybrid monuments. And at some point between 4000 and 2000 BC, there's this trend, and this trend is to produce rock art in some, but not all monuments. And again, I'll come to that in a little bit in a minute. So there we have our famous New Grange. This is the New Grange monument, the passage grave in Ireland. And in the foreground is the River Boyne. And what we've got there is a classic sort of ritualized landscape from this period. It's not just New Grange, we've got Nouth and Dowth, we've got also little satellite tombs as well. And all the things you want as a ritual landscape is there. And you've got it in other areas of Ireland as well. But it's at that point that the passage grave really takes off, around about 3000 to 3200 BC, of which this monument dates to. So the influences for passage grave construction and also probably art are coming from the west to the east across the Irish Sea. And we can also see the same sort of influences coming into the Isle of Man, for example, which is halfway between Wales and Ireland, except that some of the influences are coming from the north in Scotland to the south in Ireland, what we call the Carlingford group of monuments. So again, some very interesting, very, very busy sort of area over that 2000-year period. Now, the whereabouts. What you got there with the map on the left is a map of Wales, of course. The black dots represent Neolithic chambered tombs, and there are around about 125 extant sites, although I would up that up to about 200 because there are certain monuments which are destroyed or they're in such a battered state of repair that you can't work out exactly what they're doing. Are they passage graves or are they dolmens or whatever? And the little red dots you see are those monuments, those same Neolithic chambered tomb monuments that have rock art. And as you can see, there's just a very, very small number, really, around about 15% of the total assemblage. And the research question I'll be asking is, did people in communities start engraving this art whilst the monument was being constructed, during the monument in use, or during abandonment? So it's one of those three scenarios. So, where's the art coming from? And why is art being placed either in the monument, on the monument, or around the monument? And again, there are different scenarios for those see in front of you. So just again, just an interesting point to consider. And I will also say that as well that probably 200 monuments, extant monuments within Wales is quite conservative, because I somehow think there probably was maybe double that, maybe 500, maybe more. But the big problem we have in Wales, as we have within most of Europe, is that we have at some point within the most recent history where these sites lose their potency as spiritual and supernatural places. In Britain, it's the Age of Enlightenment, so late 18th century, early 19th century, and that coincides with the Turnpike Acts, whereby parishes were responsible for maintaining their roads. And of course, if you're maintaining a road, you need to find a quarry. If you've got a monument stuffed full of cairn, there's your quarry. And we do know that, for example, Reverend Skinner, who in 1802 did his 10-day tour of Anglesey. And whilst he was doing his 10-day tour, he witnessed the destruction of 6 Neolithic sites. So just gives you an idea about what was there prior to the Age of Enlightenment and what we have today. And again, it's sometimes the destruction is from the archaeologists, because obviously archaeology is a process of destruction. So we do see a lot of sites which have been either seriously damaged or destroyed by archaeologists within the antiquarian period or within the early part of the 20th century. But what we have in front of you is, like I say, are 15% of all Neolithic chambered tombs that have rock art incorporated in them, on them, or close by to them. Now, the history of research is what I would call a slow, and it really, in many respects, although Neolithic chambered tombs and prehistoric sites were starting to be noticed in the 17th and 18th century, it's really not until the mid-19th century that people started to get interest in the engravings that we have on these Neolithic chambered tombs. And Simpson, in his book in 1868 and also in 1867, he did a published paper. He included 3 sites, which I'll be showing you a little bit later on. A place called Bachwen, which is a cracking portal dolmen. Llanbeda, which is a stone in the nave of a church, bit of a strange one there. And also the Calderstones. And the Calderstones is just over the border in Calderstones Park in Liverpool. And again, I'll be talking about that as well. And really, from the beginning of the 20th century right through to the present day, we start to see, good systematic excavation. And again, another one of my heroes is a guy called Hemp, who'd excavated Byn Celli Ddu. He also excavated a number of other sites as well with rock art, one of them being Arthur's Stone in Herefordshire, if anybody knows that. But Byn Celli Ddu was quite remarkable, some remarkable results. And again, I'll be talking about that a little bit later on. And then we have the work of, in particular, Terence Powell, who did a lot of work in North Wales. He was from Liverpool University, and he looked at Barclodiad y Gawres, which is a passage grave on Anglesey, very, very close to Byn Celli Ddu. And he also worked on a site called Dyffryn y Dudwy, which is just north of Harlech. So he got around in his time, did some wonderful pieces of work in terms of Neolithic monuments, and really is responsible. Him and Daniels were responsible for exposing the exquisite rock art that we have at Barclodiad y Gawres. And then we have 2 people in my lifetime who were working on rock art. Really, the first people to concentrate on rock art. The first is R.W.B. Morris, who was an amateur part-time. He was a solicitor, but he did sort of a lot of work around the various rock art areas of Britain, including Scotland, Northern Britain, the Isle of Man. But when he produced his paper for the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society in 1989, he recorded only 5 sites from Wales. So in 1989, there were 5 sites recognised by R.W.B. Morris. And really, the situation didn't get much better, because we had Stan Beckinsale, who, again, another one of my heroes, did his famous rock art book. And really, in many respects, if anybody is interested in rock art, you need to look at these 2 people before you start anything or look at anything, really, because really they are the founders of modern research on British rock art. And Stan recorded again around about 4 sites, 3 to 4 sites from the Neolithic period, and maybe 7 or 8 sites from the Bronze Age in Wales. So again, the numbers are pretty low. And then we have another gentleman, a guy called John Sharkey, who listed 45 sites in his book, Meeting the Tracks. And really, in many respects, we took that table from John, and in 2004, myself and a colleague, Carol James, set up the Welsh Rock Art Organisation, and by 2020, we had 135 sites, and that can now tell you we now have 141 sites in Wales. So the numbers are growing, and it's basically this idea, and it's the trap that I fell into as an undergraduate, in that I've been looking with my blinkers at Neolithic chambered tombs, just looking at the architecture, ignoring the landscape, ignoring the rock art. Once those blinkers were off, and once you start walking, your eyes tune into the landscape, you start to find the stuff. And we are finding it, on a quite a regular basis. I would say that I get around about 2 inquiries a month now for people saying we think we've got rock art on our land or on our rock outcrop. Can you come and verify it? So we verified. As you can well imagine, I've used a lot of petrol in the last 20 odd years following all these hopeful sites. Many of them have turned out to be hopeful. And again, this is just a good point. This is a site called Llyn Peninsula, which is a single stone within an industrial landscape. It was recorded back in the middle part of the 20th century, and it's actually incorporated into the Royal Commission book of 1976. And it's basically a stone with about 75 cut marks on it. And it's in the middle of nowhere doing nothing. And my big point here in terms of landscape is that you can't look at this rock art site in isolation, because surprise, surprise, there's bound to be more rock art lurking around. And this is where colleagues of mine, Edith Evans and Martin Hutchinson, have been working in South Wales tirelessly in this area and have found about, I would say, if I remember rightly, about 15, 20 odd sites. And these are sites with multiple sites within them. So they are large parts of upland heathland landscape where Bronze Age communities were using that landscape to do their ritual activity. This particular site, I feel, may be the capstone of a Neolithic chambered tomb. But again, dare I say, excavation will only sort that one out. So it lies in the middle of a field near a site called Nelson, near a little village called Nelson, which is very much an industrial village and an industrial landscape. But you've got this thing lurking in the corner of a field doing nothing. So quite clearly, we need to look beyond the site itself. Now, the first group of monuments I want to take you to is within Southwest Wales. This is just one of 9 areas within Southwest Wales, which I've identified as what I would call clusters of where rock art and Neolithicization is occurring. And what we've got in South Wales is around about 55 extant monuments. But what is important is that a colleague of mine, Chris Barker, in 1992, did quite a big study on this area and found another 70 sites, which were either lost monuments, place name monuments, or monuments which have been destroyed or damaged, where you couldn't work out the architectural morphology of those monuments. So in total, then you've got about 130 odd sites, plus the sites that we have no record for. So Southwest Wales appears to be quite a very, very busy area for Neolithic communities. And do remember, where you see Neolithic communities in Wales, and these communities, the evidences for coastal sites, you usually got preceding that Mesolithic communities. So you've got Mesolithic communities which have got their own sort of hunter-gatherer sort of way of life, and that develops into a Neolithic way of life. And this is where you get your chambered tombs. And just to give you some idea of what I'm talking about, is that the second blob, the red blob from the left, Coton Arthur, just near there, I've found around about 7,000 pieces of Mesolithic flint. So it just gives you an idea about how busy Mesolithic and Neolithic communities were between, well, in this case, between 6,000 and 2000 BC. And what we got on that plan there, on the map on the left-hand side, are black blobs and red blobs, and they are all Neolithic chambered tombs. Okay, and what is interesting is they seem to follow, or they seem to surround, what I call the Nevin Valley catchments, that dark green area that you can see next door to the sea and moving in towards Pentrefan and Bediarafanc. And it's within that catchment you get a lot of Mesolithic activity. It's all wooded, by the way. And once you're in that valley, looking up on the hinterlands and on the ridges of the Preseli's, strangely enough, you can't see the monuments. So these monuments are being discreetly and deliberately placed in such a way that you can't see them from certain viewpoints within what I would call the working landscape. And the red blobs that you see there are monuments with rock art. So you've got 3 black blobs and 4 red blobs. 3 have no rock art, although Pentrefan may be a bit of a question mark. And the 4 red blobs are sites with rock art on them. And it's really these sites that have attracted myself and Carol from the Welsh Rock Art Organisation to do some fieldwork investigation on. And we've done Trefeil, which is the far right blob, and Trelithiant, which is the far northern blob. So we've done those two. Coton Arthur has a single cut mark on it. That was excavated by Sian Rees. And again, some very interesting radiocarbon dates came from that particular site of around about 3,000 to 2,800. And then you've got a very curious site, Cerrig-y-Goff, which is a circular stalled chamber cairn, very much like the Merrill Circle in the Isle of Man. And this particular site has rock art on the rock outcropping close by. Now, what is tantalizing here, and of course, we haven't got the time or the money to do it, but the whole field is covered with pasture grass, but there's just this one small area in the corner of the field to the north west of the site where you've got exposed rock outcropping. It would be tantalizing to think that the whole of that bedrock is covered with rock art, but we will never know unless we have the money or the time or the ingenuity to excavate the whole field, which we won't do that. So we come to our first site. This is a site I excavated in between 2011, 2013, 2014. And what we did was we did a series of staged approach archaeological field investigations. And my first question to CADU, who are the heritage agency for Wales, I said, is it possible that we can do a small slot, as you can see on the photograph on the left-hand side, small slot, just to count the cut marks on the stone? And they said no. He said, but we will let you do some excavation, which gives a more meaningful idea about what is going on with that particular site. So we end up by doing quite a large excavation. In fact, the excavation season was over 3 years. Prior to that, we had done geophysical survey, and we'd also done quite a detailed desk-based assessment. And what drew me to this site, obviously, was the rock art. We did a tracing of the rock art, as you can see on the right-hand side. But more importantly, it had been considered by W.F. Grimes, who was, again, another keeper of prehistory at the National Museum of Wales, and also the first inspector, I think, for Wales. He claimed that the stone could actually be a capstone belonging to a Neolithic portal dolmen. And so it was really that what attracted me there, to think that if we're going to do a bigger excavation, let's see what we can find. And just before I tell you what we did find, the farmer whose land it was on, very, very nice man, he passed away. But before he passed away, he said, I remember getting my tractor and pulling out a standing stone about 30 meters to the south of this particular stone, and you'll find it over here on this field boundary. And lo and behold, we found it. So quite remarkable bit of archaeology. So we've got our what I would call our landscape marker, plus the what we think is a portal dolmen, what we thought was a portal dolmen, plus the rock art. So the rock art was there, the so-called capstone was there. So the next thing we started to do was to do a small slot. This is I think a 4 meter by 4 meter slot. We did actually also excavate immediately to the right of that stone. But if any of you eagle-eyed people can see, on the right you can see lots of water. And guess what? We had some of the most atrocious weather you can imagine. But what we did find when we were doing the planning of this particular site, we did find that the cairn surrounding this particular stone was, first of all, white quartz, which is very interesting indeed. So it gives you some idea that maybe we're looking at something quite ritualized here. And more importantly, that the shape of the cairn that we were recording was kidney shaped. A classic kidney shape which is a part of the indicative architecture for a portal dolmen. And then again, to the right of the monument in the second season, or maybe the third season, we found a burial of a juvenile, which we sent to Wessex Archaeology. We actually excavated the whole area. We took a chunk of the burial as a chunk of soil, took it to the laboratory at Wessex, and they excavated it and then radiocarbon dated it. And we had a date of around about 3000 BC. And it's just what we wanted. It fitted lovely within the sort of chronology of the portal dolmen traditions we have in Southwest Wales. And we also found, just to make things really interesting, I'll just go back one, but in the slot, just to the left of, to the right of me, we found within the cairn 3 perforated shale beads, very, very similar to the ones you would see at Nab Head, which is about 25, 30 kilometers away, which are Mesolithic in date. So again, just give you an idea of that continuity between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, how the community was following at one point hunting, gathering and fishing, and then at some point over a slow period of time, the influences come in, and then they start to think about the idea of farming, probably still doing hunting and fishing and gathering, but more importantly, the mechanisms, the artistic mechanisms, the artistic endeavor of those people was not just the rock art, but also portable art as well. So we found some very interesting stuff. And then recently, since about 2016, 2017, we've turned our attentions to a site called Trellifiant, which is just to the north of Trefeil. And what we've got there is again, another portal dolmen. Guess what? It's got rock art actually on its chamber capstone. There's about 80 cut marks on there. Never been properly recorded, and the reason, our original rationale was to go there, put some acetate across the capstone, and record the cut marks and the linear grooves on that capstone, and that would be in it. But we did some geophysical survey as well. We found, and just go back a couple here, when we were doing the excavation at Trefeil, we did this geophysical survey, and what we were really surprised about was that the Aeolian deposits, the wind-blown deposits, which were coming from Cardigan Bay, had over the millennia created loads and loads of stratigraphic layers, and I covered a lot of monumentality, because what we found with this particular site, I think around about 9 possible henges, plus tracks, plus corrals, plus a very interesting squared building. So very, very busy indeed. And again, this little story, the little digressive story is that the landowner said to me, the landowner said to me, he said, "George, will you be back next year?" I said, "No, there's too much to dig. There's too much archaeology there to do any more digging." And we were there purely for the rock art, but the tantalizing thing to do with excavation was too good to miss. So similar to the Trefeil site, we also did a geophysical survey on this site. And this is just a bird's eye view of the site looking down. Do take my word for it. There are around about 80 cut marks on that capstone plus grooves. And you can also see the remnants of a mound around my 2 colleagues there. They were people who helped me excavate the site. The capstone has actually slipped from left to right. No rock art anywhere else, but only on the capstone. So it's looking up to the sky, similar to the Trefeil one. Although the Trefeil one is like that now, if it had been on as a portal dolmen, it would be in the capstone, and the rock art would be looking up towards the sky. And this is the rock art we have from the Trellifiant monument, and the scale there is 50 centimeters. So it just gives you an idea about how big that capstone is. So the first thing we did was this archaeological staged approach. We first of all did a guest-based assessment. We spoke to Cadw and asked them if we could excavate it, and what our aims and objectives would be, our research aims and objectives would be. And again, just before I move on, about 200 meters that away to the south is a standing stone. So again, there's a link again between the landscape monument and the burial chamber. So anyway, we did a geophysical survey, we did magnetometry and resistivity, and this is what we've got. So the blue blob you see in the middle of the picture there is actually the chambered tomb. The 2 white squares are the 2 small trenches that we excavated, and they are deliberately targeted over a circular anomaly, which we think is was probably a henge. But also I draw your attention to another circular anomaly, which you have on the outside of that brown ring. So again, another busy landscape. And we ended by doing actually more geophysics, and to the right of the geophysic survey area you see there, we found more and more anomalies coming up. But again, what is interesting is that the Aeolian deposits very gently come over the landscape and bury whatever's there. There's no sort of lumps and bumps you can see within the landscape per se. It's all been buried with a very, very fine Aeolian deposit. So that's what we got with the geophysics. There are obviously more things going on there. We've done a series of test bits outside the scheduling area. Just to give you some idea that the scheduling area, extends just beyond those two white trenches. So we needed a scheduled monument consent to excavate them. And we excavated those in 2019, sort of October, the most miserable time of the year to be in Wales, when it pours out down with rain, but we did get some good weather. So this is what we've got. You can just see there with the big white arrow, the plough line. So we were very lucky in many respects that the plough has gone over this site, not in living memory, but sometime in the sort of 30, 40 years ago. We know this because the landowner remembers when he last ploughed it, which was about 30 to 40 years ago. But that black line you can see within the section of that small trench, it's a 2 meter by 2 meter trench, is the plough line. And we got some wonderful striated lines of the plough turning the soil within that particular layer. And then just below that, we have two features, features 1 and features 2. And when they were excavated, this is what feature 2 looked like. Because of the nature of our excavation, it was an evaluation. So we were digging to the first significant archaeological horizon, or whichever's deepest, so the first significant archaeological horizon or natural. And that's what we got there. We had a wonderful stone setting. And then we dug out a pit. We had to dig the whole pit out because there was fragile pottery coming up. And this is what we've got, some fantastic groove work. Now, what was really remarkable about this particular project is that when we were excavating the site, I informed the team that you need to excavate the pottery with the soil on it, because I knew that Bristol University had started to develop an idea about radiocarbon dating through AMS lipids on pottery, and it was more than likely that the pottery or the residues on the pottery survived. Not only did we get the residues, which were dairy products, but we also managed to date the lipids from that pottery. And the dating was around about, again, 3,100 or thereabouts. So again, fitting nicely within that 3,000, that what we would call that middle Neolithic sequence of Neolithic archaeology. So, you know, very, very nice. So we did the excavation similar to Trofeo. We explored the landscape, the context of the dolmen and its rock art, and this is what we came across. Moving to North Wales, we've got there, and I've confused you a little bit. I've put some red ringed dots up there, and these are sites which have rock art, which are probably either Neolithic or certainly more than likely Bronze Age. But as we well know, that the transition between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, around about 2000 BC, there's a transition period of maybe up to 500-600 years either side. So some people are practicing Neolithic, whilst others are embracing the Bronze Age. And again, what I've identified there are 4 distinct groups of Neolithic chambered tombs, and named them. And obviously, the most important sites were the sites that were found on the Llyn Peninsula, which is the little sort of jut that comes out of North Wales, and also Anglesey. But there are 1 or 2 sites as well which have that element of Neolithicization, but are found within a Bronze Age context. So it's more than likely that what we're getting here, we're seeing what we would call transition monuments from this particular area of Wales. And this is the first site I want to introduce you to, a site called Bachwen. Now, Bachwen is, just go back one, it's the red blob that you see within the Llyn Peninsula group to the north, just south of Anglesey. This site is a very, very simple portal dolmen, stands around about 2.5 meters high, but on top of the capstone, we have around about 115 cut marks and series of lines as well, grooves, which intersect some of the larger cut marks. The site, as far as I'm aware, has never been excavated. It's been denuded really by the sea. You can see the photograph on the left-hand side, how close the monument is to the coast. But what is interesting is there are some interesting characteristics which I haven't talked about tonight, only because of time. But the one important thing in there is this thing, what I call dip and slant. And what you've got on most portal dolmens, both on the Irish sea side, both on the Ireland side and also on the Welsh side, or Welsh and Cornish side, is that you've got the capstone, which always dips towards the sea. And you've got that occurring nearly through the whole of the portal dolmen group, running right through Wales, from South Wales right through to North Wales. All those dolmens appear to have a dipping capstone. Now, the capstone could be like this, which is flat, or it could be globular. It doesn't matter what size it is. It's usually dipping towards the coastline. What is really interesting is that there is only maybe 5 or 6 monuments within the whole of Wales that have rock art on them. And again, this brings me to an interesting point, the research point that I brought on earlier on. Are these sites being engraved whilst they're being constructed, or whilst they're in use, or during abandonment? And I think it's probably the middle bit, while they're being used. And the reason why I say this is because if you look at elsewhere within the Atlantic facade group, so looking at the monuments of Portugal, Spain, monuments of Brittany, the monuments of Ireland, the monuments of Västergötland in Sweden, they all have very, very low percentages of rock art associated with these monuments. They're usually dolmens or passage graves. So we have in Wales, for example, 15% of extant monuments which have rock art. In Portugal, if I remember rightly, it's around about the same, around about between 12 and 15%. In Spain, it's a little bit more, about 16, 17%. But nonetheless, they are quite low in terms of their percentage, in terms of those monuments having rock art on them. And I can only think that what we're looking at here is that, which again, the interesting analogy would be looking at Christianity. Christianity lasts 2,000 years, similar to the Neolithic, of course. But in between that 2,000-year period in the Christian world, there have been many changes in the ideology and the theology of that particular religion. And one which is very, very prominent in Wales is obviously the introduction of nonconformist chapels. So you've gone from the high churches, the classic medieval church, to the very simple 18th and 19th century chapel, and still Christian, still worshipping the one God, but in a slightly different way. And I somehow think that what we've got going through the Atlantic facade between 4000 and 2000 BC, more towards the 2000 BC, say between 3000 and plus or minus 200 years either side, you've got a trend coming in whereby they're thinking, or communities are thinking, we need to put some sort of artistic endeavor inside, outside, or around our monument to make us special. And what the one big argument I would say, or the one big point I would say about these particular monuments is that although they're portal dolmens, in that they have uprights, they have a capstone, they're incorporated into a mound, no two monuments are the same. So each community are constructing the monuments in a slightly different way. It might be a short passage, it might be a long passage, it might be a long capstone or a short capstone. It might be 4 or 5 uprights, it may be 3 uprights, but they're all constructing these monuments in a in different ways, slightly idiosyncratic from the generic blueprint that's going right through Atlantic Europe. And one of those little idiosyncratic changes is at some point, somewhere actually in the Iberian Peninsula, probably northwestern Portugal, there's a move to start to think about the idea about decorating your monument. It could be through engravings, or it could be through paintings, as we've got within Portugal and Spain, or it could be a bit of both. And again, I'll show you a monument a little bit later on where I think we've got engravings and paintings, and the paintings are there to enhance the engravings. And again, I'll talk to you about that a little bit later on. I've just, as one slight digression, I've been working with colleagues at a site called Dolmen de Soto in Andalusia in southern Spain. And we did quite a big rock art project there. And we found indicative engravings, but when we started using D-Stretch, which is an algorithm, a color algorithm, a desk-based color algorithm, which teases out reds, yellows, and blacks, we started to pick up also paintings as well on that particular monument. So I've now started to think about the ideas of looking at monuments in Wales and in the British Isles, which have received either very recent excavation, or more importantly, that their stones have been buried for quite some time. And that may show, if we've got any rock art there, it may tease out some paint as well. Because I somehow think that it wasn't just the engravings that were there, but I also think that there were other things which were being enhanced through paint as well. And then just on the opposite side of the Llyn Peninsula, we have this little beauty here. This is quite a small monument. It's probably late Neolithic in date. It's a site called Caerdanny, and the castle mound, or the castle lump you can see in the background there, is Crickeith Castle. So it's a medieval landscape, but incorporated that medieval landscape is this probably late Neolithic monument. And you can just see there, they've got a large capstone, which is slanting. but it would have actually sat on top of 4 uprights. The 2 uprights you see on the right-hand side are the eastern end of this monument, and incorporated onto the stone on the left, the stone upright on the left, you have a series of cup marks. Again, this was a discovery made by the Welsh Rock Art Organisation in 2006, 2007. And again, I'll just draw your attention. We have no idea what cup marks represent. I've given you a little bit of a hint that we find a lot of, a significant amount of cup marks occurring on the capstones which face upwards towards the sky. And again, we can make all sorts of ideas about what those may represent. But what we do find is we start to see a lot of patterns emerging with the cup marks, and this is just one typical pattern that we start to see maybe 3, maybe 4 cup marks which are arranged in a crescent, and I'm starting to see that on a lot of monuments, not just within Wales but also on the Isle of Man and also in Ireland as well. So it's quite interesting that we may start to see some sort of idea of a generic pattern occurring right through northwestern Europe, which incorporates 3 or 4 cup marks which are arranged in a crescent. Again, whatever that means, all 209 people listening to this lecture may have an idea about what they may represent. So it's very ambiguous and obviously very, very complex as well. So that's Caerdanny, a small tomb complex. And then we have nearby a site called Kiskerrig. And again, a classic sort of portal dolmen monument. This is a squared chamber with uprights in a very, very remote part of Wales, just near the town of Porthmadog and the Blanfestiniog Railway. But what we've got, not here on the monument itself, but to the south west of the monument, about 20 meters away, we've got a cupmark stone. And this is a cupmark stone which was recorded by W.F. Grimes in the 1930s. And what it did, by looking at that and reading the short report, it prompted the Welsh Rock Art Organisation to actually look at the rock outcropping around the monument. So we're looking at maybe 300 or 400 meters around the monument where there's a lot of rock outcropping, especially where you've got boundaries, what I wouldn't call them modern, but you've got medieval and post-medieval field boundaries. You've also got rock art there on the rock outcropping on which the boundaries sit upon. So again, very interesting sort of area, interesting landscape, overlooking the northern part of the Llyn Peninsula. And then our first project, really, as a Welsh Rock Art Organisation, was to deal with this one. And this is a site called Esgob in the middle of Anglesey. It's probably the most, and it's just a real strange one. If any of you know the Welsh Rock Art material, I bet you haven't come across this one. And it's in someone's garden, and it belonged to the house originally belonged to a guy called Pritchard, who was an antiquarian in the 19th century, and he went around the whole of Anglesey, like all good antiquarians, collecting bits of stone and putting them in his garden as follies or as focal points within his borders. And this is one of them. This hasn't moved at all. It's been there for about 150 odd years. And so what we did, we asked if we could get permission to record it, but also to excavate around it, because we had no idea how deep that stone was embedded into the ground. Just by annoyance, it wasn't embedded at all. In fact, it just sat on top of the gravel, but we weren't to know that. And what we've got there is, again, a highly decorative stone on an Anglesey geology. We think that from Pritchard's writing, that it came from a nearby chambered tomb about 2.5, maybe, yeah, about 2.5 kilometers to the north of this of where he lived. He's also got polished stone axes in his collection as well, and all manner of lithics. So he was a bit of a collector. This is what the stone looks like when it's had all the moss taken off it. We took it off very carefully, of course, not using chemicals. And that's what we did when we did our drawing, our tracing of it. And again, quite clearly, what classic sort of Neolithic and early Bronze Age markings on there. But tantalizingly, we're probably only looking at maybe 1/3 of a much larger possible capstone. Now, the reason why I say this is because Pritchard says that he dragged this stone from a site nearby. And the only site I can think about is this site here, which is a destroyed Neolithic chamber tomb, which stands to about 2.5 kilometers to the north of his farm. So again, another sort of sub project really for people like myself is that when I've got time, when I'm about 95, I should probably hobble over there and see if I can find the rest of that capstone. So again, just an interesting point when we're looking at the historic mapping. And then we moved down the coast from the Llyn Peninsula and a little bit of Anglesey. We now move down towards Harley Castle to look at the Harley Group. And this is St. Peter's Church. And just remember the name, St. Peter's Church. He's the patron saint of fish. And originally, this poor stone that I'm about to show you had been incorporated into a stone setting just to the west of Llyn Church. The map you see on the right-hand side, the circle, which is to the left, is where the stone setting. There's two standing stones you see on the left-hand side. There were three there, but one has actually been dragged in and placed into the nave of the church. And this is what it looked like when Simpson looked at it in 1869. He did an engraving of it. And again, classic spiral, sort of thing you would see on any good rock art site up in Scotland or in or any Neolithic chamber tomb in Sardinia, for example. So again, sort of classic sort of spiral you see from that period. This is the photograph you see on the left-hand side is where it was in the churchyard in 1911. It was photographed by a guy called Neil Baines. And then the Welsh Rock Art Organisation, i.e. myself and Carol, we decided to photograph it and record it. We traced it. It's the back of the church behind the font. And what we've got there is that originally it was just recorded as a simple spiral, but we had noticed that at its time within the churchyard of St. Peter's, someone had inscribed maybe two, but certainly one fish. So that fish, that Christianization of the stone seems to be quite an important thing. We see throughout the Neolithic world, right across through Atlantic Europe, this idea of Christianizing certain sites, and we've got it here, a classic example of a standing stone. We think it might be a standing stone, which has then been Christianized sometime, probably in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And then we come to one of the big boys. This is where really some of the most amazing rock art has been found. This is into Anglesey. And again, just one interesting point here is that the passage grave tradition, that photograph I showed you earlier on of Nouth, and I talked about Douth and New Grange. Those three monuments are one of maybe 200 or 300 passage graves we've got in Ireland. When you come to the British mainland, you have 2 or 2.5 in Anglesey. There's one that looks like a passage grave, it probably isn't. So it's 2.5 in Anglesey and one other, which is the Calderstones, and all three monuments have rock art on them. But anything beyond the Calderstones, eastwards, there are no more passage graves. The next group of passage graves you have to find are up in Orkney, and then you have to go to southern Sweden, and there's a couple in Norway as well. And that's it, that's your lot. So in many respects, the Byn Celli Ddu, Barclodiad y Gawres, and also the Calderstones really mark the end of the passage grave tradition in Wales and in central and northern England. So just bear that in mind. So we got the Byn Celli Ddu here. This is what the monument looked like in the latter part of the 19th century. And I think the Welsh translation of this is that it is within a coppice of woodland, and so the name of the site reflects what the site was all about. And you just see there the large capstone that went over the chamber of monuments. The farm in the background still stands, which is good news. There was, again, this is the one site which Skinner looked at in 1802 and found that the passage grave next door to it, which was about 50 meters that way to the south, had actually been destroyed and used as roadstone. So this one survived, but the other one didn't. And this is what it looked like when Hemp got his hands onto it in the late 1920s. This is the entrance to the monument from the west. Sorry, from the west. And I just draw your attention to the rock outcrop you have behind the monument. We were there in 2004. I said to one of my students, go up there and have a look and see if you can find any cut marks. And she did. We found about 30 or 40 cut marks. And that really set the precedent for looking at further around that ritual landscape. And I'll come to those pictures in a minute. So this is what it looks like during the winter solstice. The sun comes in, sunrise comes in, hits the back of the passage, back of the chamber, on the right-hand side. But the actual stone, the actual rock art itself is outside the chamber. And what Hemp had worked out was that the passage grave actually stood upon an earlier henge monument. And in that middle of that henge monument was a ritual pit, and slumped over that pit was that stone. The stone is called the pattern stone, and it's got a serpentine type design across one of its faces and also engraved on the sides as well. The original is actually now in the National Museum of Wales, but this is a replica, but it's a good replica, and it marks the point of where the stone actually slumped over that central pit when it was a henge monument. But what is interesting is that the people who are constructing the henge monument would have understood the meanings, or they understand the meaning of what these serpentine megalithic art symbols represented. And again, if you go to your Portuguese and Spanish megalithic rock art, you see a lot of serpentine designs across a number of chambers, both engraved and painted. This is what it looks like on LiDAR. This is the two LiDAR images, both the same, but the one at the bottom there, I've just circled where the archaeology is. You can see Byn Celli Ddu as the circle on the far right, upper right. The circle below it is where that passage grave that was destroyed in 1802 for roadstone. You can see where it was. It has recently been excavated by Manchester Metropolitan University, and that I haven't seen the results yet, but again, quite interesting. The other circles which I've ringed are showing where the rock art is, and also where standing stones are. So again, what we're looking at, not just looking at the monument in isolation, we're looking at the whole of this landscape. And for those of you interested in medieval, the LiDAR is also teased out the ridge and furrow marks that we have around the monuments. So that's what it looks like. This is open air rock art. And again, what you've got there are these crescents. So you've got 4, maybe 5 cut marks there arranged in a crescent. Again, this seems to be a recurring design going right through, in particular in North Wales, the Isle of Man, and in Ireland. And then we come to the creme de la creme in many respects. This is a site that I've been involved in for the last 20 odd years. We've now finished all the tracings of the 5 stones in there, and done numerous other bits of survey in there. The site was excavated in 1952-53 by Terence Powell and Glyn Daniels, and they did a remarkable bit of excavation. Before it was excavated, this is what it looks like. It's very, very close to the sea, but it's a bit of a strange one in that all passage graves are orientated, or the passages are orientated east-west. This is one of only 2 that I know of now that points northwards. So again, very interesting sort of orientation, bit of an awkward one. But these are the photographs which were taken by Michael O'Kelly, the chap who excavated New Grange, and he came to the site. The bottom left image you have is the photograph of the site taken in 1911, prior to it being excavated in 52-53. But as you can see there, you've got stones sticking out of the ground, and the chamber is partially buried. Now, the wonderful thing about this is that all the rock art that you wanted to look at, or you can see today, would have been buried up until 1952-53. And this is good news for people like myself, because you're not getting any vandalism, you're not getting any graffiti, but also more importantly, taking the soil conditions into consideration. Remember, they're very acidic. You're also getting, very, very clean decoration occurring on some of these stones. This is just the view looking north. This is the chamber as you walk into the monument. And in 1965, they built a large concrete dome over it. It looks like a bit like a nuclear bunker, but it does protect the monument from, as I say, from vandalism, systematic vandalism, because it has occurred in there in the past, but also from the elements as well. And what is really interesting about this particular monument, if any of you have been reading Chris Tilley's early work on phenomenology, what is really interesting is that all the uprights here are igneous. The capstone, this large chunk of stone, is sedimentary. And again, there was a study that I was involved in back in 1989, early 1990s, where we were looking at passage graves in southern Sweden, and they did exactly the same, except they were reversed. Igneous rocks were on the top, and all sedimentary were uprights. So again, sort of interesting patterns. Just something I've started to look at. And again, it's this, just taking away those blinkers and trying to work out if there's any association between, you know, the geology, the color, the luster, and the rock art itself. So our work starts in 2004. We start to do, we are using a tried and tested method, an accepted method by Cadw. If any of you are sort of panicking about what those, how we are tracing the stone on our slate and using blue tack, we obviously did a project design for this, and it was accepted by Cadw at the time. And the rock is very, very hard. It's an igneous rock, so there's no worry about any sort of flaking or any sort of danger of doing any damage to the stone. And what we basically did, we just traced them like Ford Johnson did in the 1950s. Ford Johnson was an archaeologist from Liverpool Museum who came along to the excavation of Powell and Daniel, and 2 or 3 years after they had exposed the stones, he set about by recording them. He actually recorded them not just by tracing, but he also used latex as well. So he used latex molds to get the exact replica of the images that you see on those 5 rocks. This is the capstone, stuffed full of graffiti, as you will imagine, because it's been exposed. There is on that stone 1 cup mark, and then we have these beauties. These are the chamber uprights. This is C1 or chamber upright number 1 and chamber C16. And again, the rock art, if any of you can't see it, there's some really nice rock art on the left-hand image, right at the bottom, in amongst that green algae. And then you got the stone C16. And again, what's one of my little ideas of what might be going on here is this idea of bringing the landscape within. I somehow think this may be some form of abstract design. They're all abstract designs. We can't actually say for certain what they actually represent. But my view is that the spiral you see on the right-hand side of C16 at the top there is a celestial body, maybe the sun or the moon. The zigzags are the Snowdonia range, which are behind this stone, and in between the site and the Snowdonia range is obviously the Menai Straits and also Cable Bay. So you've got your water there. So that wavy line could represent water. It could be that all of us in this room at the moment have an idea about what it might represent. Well, that's my idea, and I'm sticking with it. And then in one of the chambers, this is the eastern chamber, we have a series of 7 spirals occurring on 1 stone. And again, the beauty about this particular excavation for Powell and Daniel is that the capstones over the chambers, when they were excavated, had actually collapsed and fallen onto the artifacts of the chamber, and revealed from that, or extracted from that chamber, were grave goods and also bone. What I find a bit annoying is that in the 1950s there would have been an opportunity to radiocarbonate this, but I suspect that the excavation was done on a shoestring. And again, it's again another story, because I've read the archives and they were on a shoestring, believe you me. But this is what the site would have looked like in Neolithic times. What they've got within the excavation of 1952-53 is evidence of quite a substantial hearth, which appears to have been cleaned out and then relaid, cleaned out and then relaid, and so on and so forth. And what you've got within this hearth is some really weird, you've got birds of prey bone, you've got amphibians in there, you've got domestic bone as well, plus charcoal. Again, another wonderful opportunity for radiocarbonating. But you can imagine during Neolithic times, with those torches flickering away and the fire flickering away, the designs which surrounded the occupants, both the living and the dead, would have danced and flickered before your eyes. So again, quite a remarkable sort of reconstruction of what this place would have looked like between 4000 and 2000 BC, around about 3000 BC. Come to the last site of this lecture, and I've stepped over the border because I think it's quite important. And this is the Calderstones of Liverpool, which I've just been involved in rewriting the book for it, and that'll be out in April. There's my plug. And this is a bit of a sad site, like many other sites, in particular within those areas of the British Isles where there is urbanisation. This is smack bang in the middle of Liverpool in Calderstones Park. And up until around about 1827, there was a clear delineated passage grave with more than 6 stones sticking up. Some of the stones you can see there, in both pictures, have now been matched with the stones that survive, but there would have been a lot more. And I suspect that they've been used within the rockery of Calderstones Park. I have made a note of 1 or 2 stones there, which are prime candidates for uprights and possible capstones. So there we have. So we have really, again, this one interesting point which I haven't raised, which I think is important to think about, is that the archaeological history of this site is as important as the actual archaeology itself. We, up until quite recently, we didn't actually know where the site was, but we do now know where the site is. And again, I draw your picture to the engraving to the bottom of the slide. You can see, which shows that it's on a conversion of at least 5 roads. And what had happened was, in the 1840s, the stones had been ripped up, put into a farmyard, forgotten about, and then at some point in the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, the stones that had been re-erected and incorporated into a road traffic island. And strangely enough, the road traffic island really delineates where the passage grave was. So it had been ripped up, taken away, put into a farmyard, and then they'd been re-erected and placed into a traffic island, and the traffic island itself marks and delineates where the passage grave originally was. Now, what is interesting is the 2 pictures you see on the right-hand side they're black and white, but take my word for it, because they still are in a very, very poor state of repair. They have absorbed over the last 150 odd years the pollution of Liverpool, and they are now black. They were red sandstone, they are red sandstone, but the grime on these stones is telling of what the pollution levels were like in Liverpool over that 150-year period. So those are the stones that we see them in situ. They were then moved in the 1960s into a vestibule into Calderstones Park. But the big problem was that it was in a sort of like a greenhouse. So what you've got are very hot conditions and very cold conditions, depending on what season it is. And slowly but surely, over a 30, 40-year period, these stones, well, the surfaces of these stones started to deteriorate quite severely. So in 2007, we were employed to record these stones, both photographically and using 3D laser scanning. In fact, Liverpool City Museum did a laser scan and a 3D scan of the stones, and so we've got that. So we can produce replicas if needs be. But these are the images that we took of the 5 stones, sorry, 6 stones. And what is interesting is that looking at the rock art on this particular monument, there are at least 5 different phases of 5 different phases of history associated with these stones. 2 of them which are prehistoric. Obviously, we've got our Neolithic passage grave art. We've also got our Bronze Age art. The passage grave art is obviously the concentric circles and spirals. The footprints you can see in the bottom right image, they are Bronze Age. So quite clearly the monument was being used in the Bronze Age. But we also got their medieval engravings as well. We've got a nice little turtle dove and also a church. And we've also got modern graffiti. We've also got a graffiti of 2 letters, JL. We know that John Lennon was there close by somewhere, so he could have dived in, a bit of a jack the lad. He may have jumped in and made his mark on this particular monument. But we've got the full gamut of both graffiti and rock art on these particular stones. And the nearest sort of parallel we have, I'm just referring to the feet here, the nearest parallel we have is this one, the Pool Farm Kiss, which is in Somerset. What is particularly interesting about this particular site is that it was discovered in 1928 through excavation, and then they just left the capstone and didn't do anything with it. And then Leslie Grinsell, who was then working with Bristol University, went back to have a look at the stone, or the stones, look at the kist itself, found there was rock art on it, and it's been in Bristol City Museum ever since. But again, it's just one of maybe just a handful of sites that have footprints within southern Britain. And with southern Britain, I mean Wales as well. So coming to the end of the lecture, what do we have? Why is Wales not a prehistoric backwater? Well, quite clearly, with the research certainly that I've been involved in, and it's not just me, there's people like John Sharkey, who did a fantastic bit of work with his meeting of the tracks, which he published in 2004. Quite clearly, there is a clear rock art assemblage which has been with us, which we've known about for at least the last 30 odd years. And I've identified within that sort of assembly, that distribution, sort of core areas or hotspots where rock art is. And surprise, surprise, the thing I'll be talking about tonight is Neolithic chambered tombs, but there is that idea that art equals death and death equals art, because we are getting within 15% of the monuments we have, of extant monuments within Wales, we've got some form of rock art, mainly cut marks, but there are a few or a handful of sites which reveal a little bit more than just cut marks, as I've just shown you already. So we do have the Neolithic presence here. We also have a Bronze Age presence, and again, I've really touched very little on that because of time, but the Bronze Age sites, which are really the most numerous group we have within Wales, they're usually on upland lands, within upland landscapes. Again, what is interesting is that what we're seeing on the megalithic art, we're seeing the same type of rock art occurring on landscape rock art as well, within the landscape, suggesting that we have maybe the same sort of type of meaning being expressed by two different types of community, and using two different types of scape to portray their rock art on. In the Neolithic, it's chambered tombs, and in the Bronze Age, it's open ritual landscapes. Okay, so that's again an interesting point, and I think really in many respects we're looking at 3,000 years of rock art production. I haven't even gone into Iron Age, because again we have quite a unique Iron Age assemblage as well. So again, just an interesting point to consider. And then finally, I think just one or two things we must consider. I've already talked about the first one about we do have a very diverse rock art tradition, and there is more stuff being found. And again, just one little hint is that last year during lockdown, I had a phone call from a local farmer not too far from here, just across the Welsh border. He'd been putting in a post. He dug out the post with a small mechanical excavator, pulled out some stone. His mother-in-law was looking out the window of her bedroom and saw within the light a shadow of a spiral or a concentric circle. Called me in. We had a look at it, and along with the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and also with Shropshire Council's archaeologist, and it was quite clear it was a Bronze Age. It was a part of a Bronze Age something. What is tantalising is that the stone they've pulled up, they've dumped into some woodland about 1 kilometre away, and at some point when lockdown is finished, we shall go over there and have a look and see if we can find any more rock art that may be there, which may be of use to us. We don't know if it's Bronze Age or if it's Neolithic as well. So again, the various motifs we see on both Bronze Age and Neolithic are repeated, but in different landscape and site types. I would say that the data from elsewhere is similar. So what we're seeing in Wales, we're seeing in probably in your part of the world, in Scotland as well, but obviously in Scotland and in northern Britain, it's far more concentrated. As I remember, there are around about 5,000 to 6,000 sites, 1,300 alone in Northumberland. We haven't got that sort of material, that sort of distribution in this part of the world. But what is interesting, which I think is very, very important, and I think Joanna has talked about this in her idea about connectivity, that Wales is part of that superhighway, which is spreading the influences from the Atlantic facade, from Ireland in particular, maybe also from Brittany. It's coming into the British Isles at some point around about 3,200, 3,300 BC, and then it's spreading through. And I think Wales is part of that superhighway, that connectivity that moves the ideas to the north in various forms, not so much in Neolithic chambered tombs, but certainly within the landscape rock art. So that's where I stand so far. I'd just like to say diolch yn fawr. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, George. That was absolutely fantastic. I've been on the edge of my seat for the last hour, and that was really really informative and beautifully contextualized and so on. So and really nice to see the kind of value of a kind of a holistic archaeological investigation of rock art with the excavations as well as all the recording and the geophysical surveys and so on as well. So thank you. That was great, and I think it really helps us understand Scottish rock art as well by looking at it from the Welsh perspective. perspective. And you're happy to take questions. We've got quite a lot of questions, so I don't think we're going to get through them all. But what I'll do is I'll just go through them kind of in the order in which they've been asked, more or less. If I can just bring them up here. So first of all, is there a website with a map of Welsh rock art sites on it?
No, not at the moment. I have produced a framework for, because I think now, I don't think it applies to Scotland, but certainly to Wales, there's now a national framework for various things such as Bronze Age, Neolithic, Paleolithic. And I've done one for rock art in Wales, and you can get that from the 1902 Committee rock art site. So if you just type in 1902 Committee, and the reason why it's called 1902 is because in 1902, it was the first acknowledgement that there was such thing as prehistoric rock art, which debunked Cartiac's attack on poor old, forget his name, who was running Altamira. So
okay, thank you.
There's from there you can get my email address, and if anybody wants anything, I've got a paper which was just published on a sort of summary of Welsh rock art from that period, which I've been talking about tonight. I'm happy to distribute and give.
Yeah, if you send us those details, George, we can put them on our website. So if people want to follow that up, that would be great.
No problem.
Okay. Next question then from Andrew. Do you think it's relevant that all the monuments with rock art are within sight of the sea?
Yes, definitely. And I think there's two things going on there. There's this idea of what I would call ritual economy. So the economy is obviously they have to eat to survive. And I think a lot of the throw-offs of the Mesolithic, hunting, fishing, and gathering, never go away. They're with them with the Neolithic. And I think, when you're starting to put your trust into one or two cultivated crop harvests per year, and maybe a little bit of animal husbandry, things can go wrong. So there's that incentive to stay close to the sea, where you've got that ultimate use of the landscape economies, the fishing, the estuarine, what I would call the estuarine farming, and also your agriculture as well. So there's that. So there's that point, but also I think that the sea also offers something else as well. And I think it's this idea of communication, or this connectivity that Joanna has been talking about in her latest book, which I'm reviewing at the moment, in fact. And I just think it's the way of making an easy communication link between neighbouring communities, but also communities that are coming across the sea in certain particular areas.
Okay, thank you. A comment from Alison Sheridan. Hi, Alison. Which is Alison saying, oops, sorry, just lost it. Alison saying, your grooved ware from Trellefaint, excuse my pronunciation, looks more like Fengate ware, and the 3100 BC date would fit with that. Yeah.
I probably agree. I'm not a pottery expert. This is stuff that's just been looked at by my colleagues at Bristol. But I'll make a note of that. But I would say, I mean, I've got about 35 pieces of this stuff, which is all decorated. It's waiting to go to the National Museum of Wales, where I think they'll probably have a better look at it than I can.
Okay, thank you, George. Okay, from Vicky saying, have you ever got a Welsh speaker to translate the names of your sites?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I use there's a guy called Frank Holding, who's an archaeologist and a native-born Welsh speaker. So he's been very, very good. He helped me with a lot of translation of not just the Welsh site names, but also some of the Welsh texts, because you do have within the latter part of the 19th century a number of journals which are in Welsh, so I've tackled those as well.
Okay, great. A question from Aaron Maisel, a friend of yours. What do you think was the impetus for people making the rock art on the monuments?
All of us can have a sort of very different ideas about what the rock art represents. What it is, I mean, I'll just hold this up. I'm looking at this at the moment. So if you know it, swear by it. And Elizabeth Chitwig, she talks about there's about 11 generic designs occurring, and they can be different types of cupmark, different types of lines, different types of wavy lines, triangles, you name it. But she's identified 11 characteristic generic designs within megalithic art, and they're being used right across the Atlantic facade. And I think so I think what we're looking at here is some type of pictorial language whereby the symbols are being arranged in a particular way to mean something. They've got to mean something. We don't know what they mean, but what is interesting is that with megalithic art, it's megalithic, and it's an association with death. And I would argue that the Atlantic rock art we see across the Atlantic facade does exactly the same, because what you have close by to landscape rock art is cairns and barrows and burial sites.
Okay. Does there seem to be a preference for placing cut marks on types of stones with prominent visible striations, like the outcrop near Byn Celli Ddu, or is this just an accident of erosion?
I think it's an accident of erosion, because what you've got with those rock outcrops there, a little bit of confusion is that you've got these very, because it's blue schist, and the blue schist is quite a softish rock, which you can shape and manipulate. But there's also, annoyingly, a lot of evidence of quarrying going on there, which I think is historical quarrying rather than prehistoric quarrying. But interestingly, the blue schist in certain areas where the cut marks are placed are on quite flat areas. It looks like these flat areas have been deliberately prepared for putting rock art onto them. I think that what we've got there is a deliberate, intentional way of delineating maybe a larger landscape, ritualized landscape. And quite interestingly, one thing I didn't talk about is that the Portable Antiquities scheme have plotted a number of obviously fine spots around Byn Celli Ddu, and you've got, strangely enough, nearly all the sites that have been plotted as portable antiquity sites are within that area of influence. So the rock outcropping seems to delineate some form of landscape, ritualized landscape.
Okay. A question about whether there's a possibility of rainwater collecting in the cut marks being holy water.
Well, oh crumbs. I was working with an anthropologist once. I won't mention his name, but he also suggested the idea that cut marks could also be used for holding semen and menstrual blood, which is a bit of a strange one. I'm pretty open-minded about it. Could well be an idea. I dare say all types of fluid could be put into those cut marks. I mean, there is some interesting anthropological work which has been done in the Sudan, where you've got these as the cut marks have been polished so beautifully they become rock gongs. They make sounds. So they could also have an archaeoacoustic quality as well. But the rainwater, I haven't come across that one before.
Okay. Have you tried using photogrammetry, structure from motion, to digitally enhance your any of the sites you've investigated, or are you just mainly using photography and tracing?
I'm using mainly photography and tracing, really. Only because if any of you know me and know my technological skills, which are something short of nil, I tend to leave that to the clever bods. We are experimenting. Then saying that, with the project we've just been doing in Andalusia, we were using point cloud technology to record not just the rock art, but also the whole structure of the passage and chamber at the Dolmen de Soto, which is another large passage grave. Again, the results were quite remarkable. So I tend to put the technology in other people's hands rather than myself.
It would be interesting to see, given how, in terms of the landscape rock art, how many of them are just cut marked, whether using photogrammetry might show up some faint, more complex carving motifs and so on some of the rocks and some of the capstones as well.
I've done the daft thing of going out in the middle of the night with a high-powered lamp and doing this sort of shadow photography, and that usually teases up a lot of interesting things that you wouldn't see in the daylight. I mean, it's very difficult to see. I mean, this is the beauty of working in the photograph you see on the left-hand side of this slide is again another stone from Barclodiad y Gawres. It's enclosed in a dome, so it's constantly dark, and you can manipulate the light. You couldn't pick this up with point cloud technology, unfortunately, because believe it or not, although you can see the concentric circles there just above Eleonora's head, they're almost impossible to see in normal lighting or direct lighting, because remember this is a stone which is a laminated geology, and what has happened over the time, it has either been eaten away by the acidic soil, or the laminations have fallen away. So what you're actually seeing there, and on most of the stones, apart from C16, is really the bottom bit of the pecking of each of the peck marks that make the patterns on that stone. So this is the reason why we're there for such a long time, trying to fathom out what was actually going on. And actually the drawings which were done by Ford Johnson, and I don't know how he did it, because he did it in the 1950s in daylight, and his obviously his tracings have been used by Francis Lynch, have been used by a lot of people, including myself, in fact, in previous publications. But what we did notice is what he had done with some of his drawings, what we've done are completely different. They show completely different designs, especially the rock art at the bottom of each stone, because remember those would have been covered with soil. In fact, that particular stone you see on the left-hand side is typical of that. You can just see where the vandalism has occurred and where the modern graffiti is, and where the original soil line was, because anything where there's no graffiti is where it was actually historically buried up until 1952-53.
Okay. Christina's asking, is there any rock art near or on the monuments near Cardiff, like St Lythans or Tinkinswood, which has a massive capstone?
No, it's all about geology, in fact. And what's quite interesting is that anything with limestone in it, and I think, if I remember rightly, St Lythans and Tinkinswood are limestone, they are within limestone areas. And what I've noticed, and again, Anne Tether's probably the person to ask, because she does a lot of work on rock art and flint, and by nature flint is within limestone areas. Far as I'm aware, there's nothing being found in that part of the world, apart from the odd cut-marked glacial erratic on maybe a standing stone, which you do get quite a lot of standing stones within that part of the world. But as far as I'm aware, there's nothing because of the geology. The same is up in North Wales as well, around Llandudno. We've got a couple of, about 3 or 4 monuments there, which are made from limestone, but there's no rock art. And I just think it's that preference. The preference is that when artists are making rock art in monuments, they're using things like, for example, hard igneous rocks, as we have at Barclodiad, but also the most preferred one is sandstone. Various granular sandstones to make them up, because it's softer. So it's a softer rock to use. But I don't know why they're not using it on limestone.
Okay, thank you. So a question from Liz, who says, I very much like you sticking with the idea of what the art might represent, but I have to ask, what is your reasoning for this? And is there any other evidence that they might be thinking this way in terms of representing places?
No, and no. I would defy anybody, any specialist in Neolithic. A long time ago, there was an Italian colleague who says he has the answers for why rock art's been produced in the Iron Age, and you don't, because you don't have that mindset. My mindset is completely different to what my mindset was 20 odd years ago, or what my parents' mindsets were 50 odd years ago. So I just think it's absolutely impossible to work out what is going on. I only speculate because of what I see with my 21st century mindset. Like, don't we all?
Excellent. And on that note, I think we're now pretty much at 7 o'clock, George. So
right.
We've still got quite a lot of questions unanswered. Apologies to everybody for not being able to cover everything. But it's great that there are so many questions. You've obviously inspired a lot of, provoked a lot of thoughts and a lot of comments from people. So thank you so much again, George. That was absolutely brilliant. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for the team for helping with the talk, and Linda for moderating. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Sorry that we can't actually see you, but we know you're there, which is great. And if you've enjoyed this talk, then please join our next webinar, which is on Monday the 26th of April, same time, 5:30, and that's Dr. Hugo Anderson Waymark from the National Museums of Scotland talking about portable art and the carved stone balls of Scotland. So that promises to be another fascinating, gripping talk. But thank you again, George. That was a really, really superb lecture. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
And look forward to seeing your publications.
Okay.
Okay, stay with us, George, and we'll just say goodbye to everybody else.